It's always been my personal strategy to try and set high goals and plan and work to accomplish them in the best possible way, and to be optimistic about the outcome. It's also important to look at what could possibly go wrong so that I don't ever commit myself or make a mistake that if something does go wrong, that it will ruin my plans. And I'm sure you feel that that's an appropriate way for yourself as well. In that light, I want to share some information about the Federal Reserve and some of the things that are happening. What I'm trying to do is basically identify some of the changes that are likely to take place in the next few years. At this point, I can't tell you when they'll happen or in what order. Closer to the events, perhaps I can give you some early warning, but you have to have some understanding before I share ideas with you. In 1913, the United States Congress produced a great private monopoly, a criminal organization called the Federal Reserve. I've talked about it before. I'd say it's the second greatest criminal organization in the world behind the Congress because the Congress created it. In our Constitution, gold and silver were money. The purpose of the Congress one purpose was to make sure that the purity of the gold and silver was correct and that the weights were properly identified. That was the American money. Congress passed their responsibility to this private criminal organization called the Federal Reserve in 1913. The income tax was established not to pay the national debt, not to buy the things the national government needed, but to ultimately to provide a source of interest payable to the Federal Reserve for the phony money that they were meant to create. Now, at the beginning, the Federal Reserve notes were exchangeable for gold and silver. And once people got used to that idea, then they made a flip. Those notes are exchangeable for nothing now. In fact, they're called I owe you nothings in some circles. The Federal Reserve was a copy of the Bank of England. The Bank of England was an interesting piece of work. When the king wanted to conduct some more wars and ran out of money, he went to the bankers and they made an agreement. The bankers would create phony money for him to buy armies and navies and Marine Corps and what have you, so they could basically conquer a good part of the known world. In exchange, the government, the king in this case, would protect the bankers from their fraudulent activities. Again, the Federal Reserve is basically a copy of the Bank of England. Well, what happened in England? They used all that money to raise big armies and navies. They did conquer lots of countries, but in the process, they spent a whole lot of money. They even conducted the Boer War when gold and silver and diamonds were discovered in Africa, and they stole those resources away from the Boers, the Dutch settlers that had lived there for a long, long time and called it home. They lost a lot of people in those battles. Then they lost a generation of young men in World War II, and because of the unfair peace that ended World War II, they lost another generation. Now England's a second-rate nation. What we basically see of them is they're people who dance and sing or judge dancing and singing. They can make a lot of money doing that, but it's a second-rate country. The Federal Reserve simply produces money on a keyboard. It's all a sleight of hand. Suppose the government needs $1 million. They print a piece of paper called $1 million bond. Someone, if they buy that bond, will give the government $1 million, and then the government will pay interest on the million. So the Federal Reserve just simply produces $1 million on a computer keyboard, exchanges that computerized money for that bond, and holds the bond. They collect the interest on that bond every year and pay a lot of it back to the American government. It's nothing but a rabbit in a hat. The Federal Reserve has been given control of the banks. 12 banks own the Federal Reserve, mostly American banks and a couple of foreign banks. They're just partners in crime. The Federal Reserve allows them to lend out $10 for every dollar deposited. In fact, it's much worse than that. Statistics show that for every $100 a bank lends, they usually have about $1 to $3 on hand, which means that if 1 to 2% of the people ask for their money back, there wouldn't be any money to give back. The Federal Reserve creates a lot of money, but the real inflation comes with the banks themselves. Again, the banks at least loan out $10 for every dollar that's deposited, and some different, depending on the kind of bank it is, they may have $60, $70 lent out for every dollar that they have on deposit, or $60, $70 gambled for every dollar on deposit. It's interesting, the bank on yourself concept does not make inflation, because if you use an insurance company, a life insurance company that's owned by the policyholders, a mutual company, as the banking function, they're the only honest banking function in the country as we stand now. You put in $1, they lend out $1 for interest, and they do it on a basis where they're not gambling the money. So there's no inflation created. In fact, if 10% of the people in this country were to have bank on yourself accounts and actively use them and eliminate the banks from their living, all the inflation would disappear. Now, realize something. The elites who are really running this country now, mostly bankers and people in large corporations, they're the real constituency of our Congress. We may be important to the Congress, to voters, as voters for the Congress and for the presidency, but we're only important until the election is over, because the real constituents are the banks and the big corporations. That's why when 80% of the population says do something or don't do something, it has no effect on the Congress at all. These insiders, these elite people, warn each other in advance of what's happening. This is a warning from the United States financial regulators, including the Federal Reserve, FDIC, and International Monetary Fund. This warning says, they're warning us of, quotes, continuing gaps between industry practices and the expectations for sale and sound banking, end of quotes. In other words, the banks are going broke, and they're preparing one another for this catastrophe. When the catastrophe happens, you can bet what'll happen after that. They'll say they warned us. It's cryptic, I give you. They'll say they warned us and blame us, or blame corporations. They'll blame somebody, but not themselves for the failure. Just think, banks are now holding $3.9 trillion in risky mortgages and other risky loans. An enormous amount of money has been lent to fracking companies. What a wonderful breakthrough. But it was done on low interest rates, and now that the price of oil is so low, they cannot pay back those loans. Many of them will go under. So there are trillions of dollars out there, many trillions. If there were only $5 trillion in bad debt out there, and there's only $1 trillion in money in existence, you can see that's already a problem. As I mentioned in another discussion, there are probably about $1.5 quadrillion in bets that different banks have made, primarily the major 12 banks that own the Federal Reserve. They think they're safe because the Federal Reserve can create money on a computer keyboard, but it can't last forever. So there's a potential credit collapse. The Federal Reserve itself, to save the banks in 2008, bought many of their worst mortgages and worst loans. So they paid the bank good money created on a computer keyboard, to eliminate the bad loans from the banks so that they would look good. Now the Federal Reserve owns those bad loans. That's about $4.5 trillion in liabilities they bought from the banks, including $57 billion in equity. There are some remedies. Money under the mattress, I've talked about that in past discussions. The bank on yourself is helpful because it at least would eliminate, if enough people did it, at least it would eliminate the inflation, which is always a factor that we have to consider. In closing, I just want to read you a quote from one of the research documents that I pay for every year to stay in touch with these things. I quote, "The Federal Reserve itself is the one in big, big trouble. To help you understand why, I want you to look out at your neighborhood window. Imagine a sudden drop in housing prices. Everyone in your neighborhood decides to put a for sale sign in their yard at exactly the same time. This, of course, will drive down the value of your home. So you devise a plan. You decide to take out loans to buy up all the houses on your block for inflated prices, all to try to prop up the value of your home. When you do this, home prices in your neighborhood will look fine on the surface. But when you look under the hood at your financial situation, you now have enormous loans for houses that don't have nearly as much value in the real marketplace." That's part of this scam that's going on now. And one of the reasons I'm predicting for some time now that probably in the next 3 years, the prices of houses will likely drop another time like they did in 2007 and 8. It would be my guess that they may drop to the prices that they commanded probably in the year 2000. So you might, as a starting place, you just might look at the price of your house was worth in the year 2000 and see how much more it's worth now. That's your potential loss. It may not happen that way. It may happen more than that. It may happen less. It's a starting place in the discussion. I hope you found this useful.